Most of you are probably already aware that the Source engine is the foundation of plenty of Valve's games, like Team Fortress 2 and Half-Life 2 and Portal and Left 4 Dead. But if you're like me, you've probably wondered before if there's a limit to Source. In particular, I asked myself what the size of the Source engine was. For example, how much area is the player capable of inhabiting, or how big can you make a map, and what happens if you go into out of bounds for long enough? I decided to experiment and find an answer to these questions, and the answer is admittedly a bit complicated, but also rather intriguing. Before we get started, however, we're going to put in a few console commands to help us with answering these questions. The first is cl_show_fps, which we will be setting to a value of 2. The command has 3 possible values, with 0 being off, 1 displaying your frame rate in the map you're on, and 2 displaying the frame rate in map, except the frame rate here is smooth FPS, so it won't update on every single frame. On top of that, setting the value to 2 also shows the minimum and maximum frame rates you've achieved since turning on the command in parentheses, as well as the average time in milliseconds it takes to render each frame, which updates on every frame. The next command is cl_show_pause. This has 2 values, with 0 being off and 1 enabling it. We're going to enable it, which will display our current position in XYZ values, our view angle in pitch, yaw, and roll, and our velocity in units per second. We're going to need this in order to see how far out we are. Do note that the Source engine uses the x-axis for north and south movement, y-axis for east and west movement, and the z-axis for height. I'm also going to be using the developer command, and I'm only setting it to 1, which will simply show minor developer information, and it will show console output in the top left for convenience. With that out of the way, we can immediately answer the first question of map size. As you can see here, I've loaded up a map that I made, which is as big as the engine will allow me to make. The map is 32,767 units on every side, which is actually the maximum value for a signed 16-bit integer number, so this cap likely has something to do with that. The map is gigantic. Just a no-clip diagonally across it would take 32 seconds at the default no-clip speed of 1,504 units per second. And as for accelerated backhopping, which averages between 2,000 and 4,000 units per second at the fastest, or about 2.5 times that of no-clip, it still takes 13 seconds to go across the map diagonally. Now, it should be noted that the volume that the player can actually inhabit is slightly smaller than the size of the map itself, and this is because we need to have walls on a map, otherwise entities would leak. So, since you can't have walls that are of 0 thickness, there is a 1 unit thick wall on all sides of the map. Now, while the map is the limit of where we can go normally, we have no clip, as well as the set pause command, which is essentially Source Engine's teleport command. You put in coordinates and it sets your position to said coordinates. To get started, I load up a test map of mine, as you can see here, and then give myself all the weapons in the game using Impulse 101. I then enable no clip and set my position to the map's origin at 0 on all 3 axes. Do note that using set pause actually sets the player's position on the z-axis 64 units higher than the inputted value to prevent getting stuck in the floor, hence why I'm using -64 as the z value. I also have a key bound to set my view angle facing north, so we can move along the positive x-axis. When we have everything set up, we head into out of bounds, with our first stop being 20,000 units out, not that far from the main map. Here you see typical out-of-bounds behavior like you would expect. For example, the player is considered stuck and can't move without no-clipping. One thing that does happen normally in out-of-bounds that's a little weird is the flashlight. When turned on, it turns all of out-of-bounds white. Now, the flashlight is actually just a projected texture treated as a dynamic light. This may be the reason as to why it does this, but I'm actually not sure myself. One other thing to note is the fact that map geometry is fading as we move out, due to the fact that the geometry only renders from so far away to save resources. The maximum distance by default from which a unit of geometry will render is about 28,600 units, but this can be affected by some factors. We then move along to 50,000 units out. It's at this point that the map is completely out of rendering distance. You can't see it anymore from here. But other than that, nothing else has changed, and everything would appear to function as it should here. Or so you would think. If I switch to the 357, you can see on the cylinder that there's some flickering going on when I'm not looking directly down an axis and moving my view. This effect is also visible on the gravity gun, most notably on the top arm of it, as well as near the end of the crossbow and minorly on the bug bait. In fact, this is happening on all of the weapons, but other than the ones I just mentioned, it's not really noticeable. At least not yet. After taking note of the effects that happen at 50,000 units, we move along to 100,000 units. The effect on the weapon models has become much more noticeable now. For example, it can be seen pretty much all over the gravity gun. One strange effect to out of bounds that happens normally is if you set matte full bright to 1, which enables full bright lighting, and you're on a map using only a 2D skybox, the skybox will render when looking back towards the main map. This won't happen when setting matte full bright to 2, which changes all albedos to a gray texture to leave light information. We're going to leave matte full bright on to better see the weapons since out of bounds doesn't have proper lighting, but remember that skybox rendering effect for later. Now let's move along to 500,000 units. At this point, the effect on the weapons we saw before is extremely noticeable. The gravity gun, 357, crossbow, and bug bait are glitchy all over. And on top of this, the effect has become a lot more noticeable on other weapons too now. This includes everything except for the crowbar, which is still very hard to notice it on. So the obvious question here is, what exactly is causing the view models to do this? Well, this effect is a rendering issue caused by being this far out. If I could bring, say, a physics prop out this far, you would be able to see that the effect would happen on the prop as well. Thus, this happens with every model that comes out this far, not just view models. More interestingly, this has varying degrees of it. See, as you go out, including within the main map in fact, the effect will get worse as your position on an axis reaches different powers of 2. And the effect will stay at its current severity, but once you pass the next power of 2, it gets worse. You can even see this on the main map if the map is large enough, as you can see here on the max size map I've made. Of course, most maps won't be this big, but in some custom maps, such as Gary's Mod's famous GM Big City, you can see this effect in the actual map. Now, there is a larger reason as to why this happens, but we'll cover that in a minute. Continuing on our journey into out of bounds, we then move along to 1 million units out. At this point, it's quite noticeable that the idle animations of models are a bit jittery, again as a result of being out this far. The rendering glitches we were talking about before have gotten worse as we have passed 2 to the power of 19. Once we move on to 5 million units, or beyond 2 to the power of 22 units out, even looking straight along the x-axis provides the glitchy rendering. The idle animations are just as, if not more jittery than before, and the rendering of the view models is so broken now that weapons become a completely jumbled mess from some angles. But other than that, there really isn't much new here. $10 million units. The model rendering has become even worse, and the models completely break down at the right angles. But interestingly, that's not all that's happened. Now, the skybox is starting to be affected by our movement. If we use the fact that we can look back and see the skybox now with full bright on, we can see that the skybox has some rendering issues going on with it as well. The skybox breaking is something I don't have an explanation for, but if I had to guess, it's likely something similar as to why the models break down. Moving directly to 100 million units, or over 2 to the power of 26 units out, the rendering glitches at this point make it so weapons are completely unrecognizable from certain angles, and in fact from some angles, they just straight up disappear. The skybox breaking has also become quite major, as now the skybox basically breaks down completely as we move our view. But that isn't all that's changed. At this point, if I turn on the flashlight, you can see that the void will now flash as I move my view. And I'm not sure what causes this, similar to the reason as to why it makes out of bounds white, but if I had to guess, this might just be the point where traditional lighting begins to break down. We move to 500 million units, where the rendering on the view models and skybox have become extremely broken. It becomes near impossible to make out what any weapon is from any angle, and the skybox becomes mostly, if not all black from most angles. And the flashlight is really living up to its name as a flashlight. At 1 billion units out, or over 2 to the power of 29, the glitchy rendering on my view models, the skybox, and the flashlight have gotten even worse. However, something new is happening. If I try to no-clip forward along the x-axis, I can't. I can move just fine along the y and z axes, so why can't I move across the x-axis? Like, what's the deal with that? Well, it all has to do with how the source engine handles position and things called floating point numbers. Here's a gist of floats and how they affect this. The source engine calculates your position using a floating point number for all 3 position values. These numbers, unlike other types of numbers in computing, can actually represent decimals. Floats consist of 32 bits, which are divided into 3 parts: a sign bit, which tells whether the number is positive or negative, an exponent, which is made of 8 bits and used to help determine things such as where the decimal will be placed, and finally a mantissa, which is made of 23 bits and used in representing the significant digits of the value. Floats can actually hold very large values in them, being able to represent a value up to positive or negative 3.4 E38. Without scientific notation or anything, that number is 340 undecillion. That number is huge, but even then, it's not the maximum or minimum. See, floats can't actually overflow or underflow like other computing numbers, and rather, once they increase or decrease past positive or negative 3.4 times 10 to the 38, they reach a special value of positive or negative infinity, usually represented as plus inf or minus inf. So how does this pertain to being able to move then? Well, after every power of 2, the space between possible float values will double. Near 0, this is unnoticeable, as the space between possible float values is extremely small, even if it does double every power of 2. But over time, it adds up. This means as you move out, the available x values that the player can inhabit have increasing distance between them. It eventually gets to the point where the default noclip speed just isn't enough to cross the gap between these available x values. By increasing our noclipping speed, it would be possible to cross this, as you can see here. By using SV_noclip speed, I can set my noclipping speed to 2,240 units per second, which allows me to cross this gap. At this point, each inhabitable x value is 64 units apart, which is nearly the player's height in Half-Life 2. But floats aren't only responsible for this movement issue we're seeing. Imprecision in rounding floating point numbers is the reason that models break down as we cross different powers of 2. Essentially, models are made up of different parts, typically triangles in a 3D world, and they start and end at defined points called vertices. Each vertex has a position value for itself, so it knows where to be on the model, and because of this, as we move out, their positions get less and less precise every time, resulting in the breaking down of models as you move out into the game world. This happens in a lot of 3D games too, not just Source games. In fact, most 3D games have this phenomenon in them. Moving along to 10 billion units out, at this point the rendering breaks completely on the view models. I can't see any weapons in my hands anymore, the skybox will render, but it's extremely broken, and the flashlight glitchiness has gotten even worse. $100 billion units, or rather, almost 100 billion. We need to remember that since some float values simply cannot be achieved due to rounding, we can't stand directly on 100 billion. Out this far, the flashlight and skybox rendering is as broken as can be. In fact, the latter is so broken that recoil from firing weapons causes some serious shaking when looking at the skybox. $300 billion units. Skybox rendering is completely broken, just causing flashing when we're looking at it. We're extremely far out, and in fact we're about as far as we can possibly go, for that matter. Here you see me put in the biggest value I could possibly get to by setting my position. 393 billion. I can't teleport any further than this or the game will crash. From this point out, we can only try physically no-clipping, which at that distance requires SV no-clip speed to be set to at least 3,414 to be able to move between X-planes. This means you're going to be no-clipping at 1,092,480.13 units per second. At this distance, there are 32,768 units between habitable X-planes, or otherwise known as a single maximum-sized map between habitable X values. At this point, we're beyond 2 to the power of 38 units out. By no-clipping the rest of the way, this gave me a larger maximum value. Using an SV no-clip speed of 750,000, I made it to the real number at which the game crashes. This was 393,698,639,872 units out, or somewhere around there, as it changes occasionally. I'm not exactly sure why, but I also gave a shot at teleporting to the next power of 2 directly from 393 billion, but the game still gave up. Thus, somewhere around 393.69 billion units out is the maximum inhabitable area for the player before the game crashes. But now the question is why? Why does the game crash? Well, according to the data I pulled from the crash, it appeared to be an access violation supposedly related to V-Physics, which is Source's built-in 3D physics simulation engine. My theory is that the physics engine broke down completely beyond about 393.67 or so billion units, and that's what crashed the engine. However, I could be completely wrong on this and would like to hear what you think about it. Interestingly, I don't think much of anything can even exist out this far. Even throwing a grenade and using the ENT text command to debug it shows that it appeared at the map's origin. The console even states that it's a bad set local origin. Interestingly, the laser dot from the RPG can exist out this far, however any object that has physics, such as this medkit, will simply appear at the map's origin. We can't go back by teleporting and visit it though, since the game will crash if we attempt to set our position back at all, again another access violation by the looks of it. Attempting to fly back with no clip will also crash the game, as when I tried on my own, the game crashed when I passed about 372 billion going back. It seems that the point of no return is somewhere around 2 to the power of 37. Trying to go backwards beyond this point, or trying to teleport directly to it from the map origin, will crash the game. On top of this, trying to teleport to anything beyond that without slowly coming up to it in intervals of teleports will also crash the game immediately. But that was the answer to our question of size. Some things have been left unanswered, so if I find any more answers, I'll keep you updated. If you have any ideas on what some of those answers may be, such as the flashlight interactions in Out of Bounds, or the definitive reason of why the game crashes, or why there's a point of no return, feel free to comment it. I read every single one of them. And of course, thank you for watching.